Shunned even by her own parents, Miriam lived on the fringes, utterly invisible to the small town that chose to ignore her. Then one silent night, a hooded man took her without a word, no scream, no trace. Days later, letters began to arrive. Signed with a name she'd never told a soul. The night air in Maple Hollow carried a strange stillness, one that wrapped around Miriam like a second skin as she walked home from her late shift at the diner. Her shoes clicked against the sidewalk, the sound bouncing off empty storefronts, unheard and unimportant. No porch lights flicked on for her. No neighbor waved. If she vanished, she often wondered, would anyone even notice? She paused by the rusting gate of her parents' yard. Their porch light was off, as always. She didn't live there anymore, not really. Just slept in the basement when she had nowhere else to go. She was halfway down the path when she felt it, a shift in the air, like a breath held too long. She turned. No sound. Just a man, standing under the street lamp, hood low over his face. And then, nothing. No scream, no struggle. Just a sense of weightlessness, as though her body had been scooped from the world without a ripple. 3 days later, the first letter arrived. Folded neatly, placed on her childhood pillow, addressed in handwriting that made her heart stop, because at the bottom of the page, in ink darker than blood, was a name no one should have known. Not anymore. Not ever again. Miriam wasn't born, invisible, but she learned how to become it. In a house where silence was mistaken for peace, and being unnoticed meant staying safe, she taught herself to breathe quietly, to step softly, to exist like a shadow against the wallpaper. Her mother, Diane, always had something more important to do than notice her. A new casserole recipe, a gossip call with Mrs. Elkins, rearranging the spice rack, and her father, Joe, barely looked up from the television unless it was to grunt about the electric bill or remind her not to slam the door. By the age of 10, Miriam had memorized every creaky floorboard, every sigh that meant go away, and every glance that might precede a dismissive shrug. At school, it wasn't much better. Small-town kids sensed weakness like blood in the water. Miriam didn't raise her hand, didn't speak unless spoken to, and never, ever made a scene. Her backpack was always zipped tight, her shoes worn but clean. She passed through the halls, like mist, there, but not quite real. Teachers forgot her name. Peers forgot her presence. Sometimes she forgot herself. But the worst was the birthday parties she was never invited to. The way her classmates whispered and passed notes, looking right through her. Once, in 8th grade, she stood outside the community center, watching through the window as balloons bounced and kids danced to pop songs. Her name had never been on the list, but she'd come anyway, just to see if anyone might turn and wave. No, one did. The loneliness didn't ache all at once. It was more like a slow bruise that spread with time. She stopped expecting warmth, stopped asking questions. She became the kind of girl no one waited for, no one missed, and, most haunting of all, no one remembered. And yet, even then, there was one secret she carried, tucked deep in her memory, like a shard of glass wrapped in velvet. A name, not Miriam. The name she was born with, the one her parents stopped using after the fire, after everything changed. She hadn't heard it in over a decade, until now, because that name was signed at the bottom of the letter. The first time Miriam saw him, it was dusk. She was walking home from the grocery store with a sack of canned soup and discount shampoo, her usual Tuesday errands. The path she took cut behind an old pine grove, dense, quiet, the kind of place kids used to dare each other to run through at night. She liked it there. The trees didn't ask questions. That evening, though, something felt tilted. The air was heavy, not just from humidity but from something else. A pressure, like eyes pressing on her back. She slowed, stopped, and turned. He was standing by, the tree line, not moving, not hiding either, just there. A man, tall, wearing a dark hoodie, the kind that swallowed his face in shadow. His hands were in his pockets. He didn't step forward, didn't run, just stood watching her like he knew exactly where she'd be and when. Her pulse flickered, but oddly, she wasn't afraid. At least not in the usual way. It wasn't the kind of fear that made you scream. It was quieter, stranger. A sense of being studied, known. She looked away first, gripping her bag tighter and walking faster. She didn't run. Running would have admitted something was wrong. Running made you pray. But after that evening, she began to notice him more often. At first, only occasionally, near the bus stop, across from the laundromat, once near the edge of her mother's street. Always distant, never close, never threatening. It was almost like he wanted her to see him, and she did. Always. Then came the night she didn't make it home. The night Miriam disappeared, the town barely blinked. The diner clock had just hit 11:07 p.m. when she hung up her apron, tucked her tip money into her sock, and stepped into the thick summer dark. The streets were empty. A few porch lights glowed like dull stars, but no one was watching. No one ever was. She cut through the pine grove like usual, short-cutting home to her mother's basement door. That night, though, something was different. Not the air, not the sky, her. Her breath was too steady. She felt it before she saw him, again, like always. The pressure, the quietness that wasn't just about sound, but presence. She slowed. And this time, she didn't pretend not to see. He stepped out from between the trees. Same hoodie, same distance. But now he moved forward. She should have screamed, should have backed away, should have run or fought or anything. But she didn't. Because the strangest thing happened. Something inside her settled. Like part of her had been waiting for this, whatever this was. He didn't speak. Didn't touch her at first. He simply looked at her, head tilted like he was reading the last page of a story he'd memorized. Then he reached out, slow and precise, and placed his hand gently on her wrist. And she went with him. Not dragged, not coerced. Led. No one heard a sound. No one saw a thing. Miriam vanished from the world like a breath into the night. And in her place, a single thing was left behind. Her name tag, cracked down the middle, lying in the grass. Miriam woke to the scent of cedar and something faintly metallic. Blood, maybe, or rust. The room was dim, lit only by a single bulb hanging low from the ceiling. She sat up slowly, muscles stiff, breath catching as she took in her surroundings. It wasn't a dungeon. It wasn't even dirty. The bed she lay on was made, the sheets clean. A tray of untouched food sat on a wooden desk. There were no chains, no bars, just 4 plain walls, and no windows. The door was locked, but not harshly. There was no screaming. From behind it, no sounds of footsteps pacing or locks clanking. It felt intentional. Not like a prison, more like a waiting room for something unspoken. And then there was him. He came in once a day, never spoke, never made sudden moves. He'd place food on the tray, glance at her with unreadable eyes, then leave. There was no violence in him, no aggression, but no comfort either. It was like being watched by a statue that somehow breathed. For 2 days, that was it. The routine held, and Miriam didn't break it. She didn't yell, didn't beg. She simply observed. Something told her this wasn't about punishment. It felt curated, as if someone wanted her calm, alert, ready. On the 3rd day, something changed. A piece of paper sat on the tray beneath her toast, folded once, no envelope. She opened it with cautious fingers, half expecting a ransom demand. or a threat. Instead, it was a letter, handwritten, careful, almost elegant, and at the very bottom, signed in neat, deliberate strokes, "Love always L." The name it was signed with, just a single letter, meant nothing at first, until she looked again, because no one could have known that name, not unless they'd known her before the fire, before she was Miriam. Long before she was Miriam, she was called something else, something softer, more lyrical. A name her mother once whispered when she tucked her in at night, back when their house still smelled of lavender and not of silence. But that name died the summer she turned 7. It wasn't just the fire. It was what the fire took. Afterward, her parents insisted on a fresh start, a new town, a new name. They never spoke of what happened, never allowed her to bring it up. The old life was gone, and with it, that name. It became a ghost she wasn't allowed to remember, until now, because there it was, scrawled in ink, the name she hadn't heard in over 15 years, a name she never told anyone in Maple Hollow, a name she herself had nearly forgotten how to pronounce. The letter didn't explain much. It was strange, disjointed. Lines like, "You used to love rainstorms. You hated orange soda but drank it when I did. Do you remember the treehouse? The deal we made?" There were no threats, no answers, only fragments, tiny pieces of a puzzle she didn't realize was missing. But that name at the bottom, that was no accident. She ran her fingers over the paper, half expecting it to vanish. The voice in her head, the one she buried years ago, whispered, "He knows who you are, who you really are. But how? And more urgently, why now?" The next morning, a second letter arrived. And this time, it didn't come with breakfast. It was slid. Under the door just before dawn, no tray, no footsteps, just the soft whisper of paper on wood. Inside was a question, one that made her stomach twist. Why did they pretend you never existed? The letters began arriving daily, slipped beneath the door or tucked under her plate like a cruel dessert, each one more intimate than the last. They didn't threaten her, but they cut, deeply, like someone peeling her memories back with surgical precision. They spoke of things no one should know, how she used to trace raindrops on the window with her pinky finger, how she once stole a silver bracelet from her mother's drawer and buried it in the backyard just to see if anyone would notice. No one ever did. The letters were written with the tone of someone who had watched her, not in the past few months, but years ago, before the silence, before her parents moved her away and told the world she never existed. Each letter was signed the same, L, and it wasn't just the details. It was the voice in the letters. Whoever wrote them remembered her as someone precious, not invisible, not broken. It was like reading a version of herself that hadn't been erased. A girl full of opinions and laughter and impossible questions. A girl who once believed someone would listen. But there were darker lines too. Words that twisted like thorns between the sweet memories. You were never meant to disappear. I know what they did. You deserve to remember everything. One letter arrived torn, its ink smeared as if the writer had hesitated or cried. Another was burned at the edges, a singed reminder of the fire that started everything. The strangest part. Miriam started to look forward to them, not because she trusted Elle, not yet, but because the letters felt more real than anything she'd experienced in years. They gave shape to her own fractured memories, coaxed her into recalling things she'd been told were dreams, mistakes, lies. She began to suspect that maybe, just maybe, she hadn't imagined the boy in the fire. And if he was real, and this was him, what had he been doing all these years? More importantly, why come back now? It came back to her all at once, like a rush of breath after being held underwater for too long. The letter that day was different. No stories, no questions, just one line scrawled in that same familiar ink. Remember the fireflies. And suddenly, she did. She was 6, maybe 7. It was late July, thick with heat and crickets. Her bare feet were dirty, her face smudged with melted popsicle. She and a boy, blonde with skinned knees and wide, clever eyes, had snuck out past bedtime. They were in the back field behind her house, a jar between them, chasing flickers of light in the tall grass. They had a secret place, a hollowed-out tree trunk near the edge of the woods, where they whispered about running away, about being pirates or scientists or astronauts. They made a pact. If anything bad ever happened, they'd meet there. And then came the fire. Not just in the house, it spread in her memory like a red fog, flames licking the hallway, her mother's screams, the boy pulling her by the arm. A door, slamming shut. After that, nothing. Her parents told her it was an accident, that she'd imagined the boy, that the trauma had confused her. They moved within weeks. New house, new name, new rules. Never talk about it again. But she hadn't imagined it. Not the boy, not the fireflies, not the pact. And now, all these years later, the man in the hoodie had brought it all back, letter by letter, memory by memory, which meant the question wasn't if he was the boy. It was why he hadn't saved her again, and whether this time she'd be able to save herself. It was the tilt of his head that gave it away. On the 7th day, for the first time, he sat across from A. No tray, no letters, just silence between them like a wire stretched tight. His hoodie was off now, and though the years had sculpted him into someone harder, leaner, older, she knew. His name came back like a gasp. Liam, the boy in the fire, the one they said never existed. She stared at him, and his eyes didn't flinch. He looked the way she remembered. Intense, too quiet, too observant. But there was something behind it now. Pain, and something else. Guilt. "You remember me," he said softly. The first words he'd spoken since taking her. It wasn't a question. He already knew. "How?" she whispered. "Why?" He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "Because they made you forget. They made everyone forget." And it worked. For a while. Her mind was spinning. "You were real." "Yes. They told me I imagined you." They lied. He told her about the fire, finally. How he pulled her out, but went back in for someone else. Someone who never made it. How her parents found her outside, alone, and let the story twist in their favor. A child saved by accident. A tragedy they didn't want tied to anyone else's name. So they erased him. Told her he never existed. Moved towns. Changed her name. Buried her history in silence. "But why now?" she asked. "Why bring it all back?" His voice cracked. "Because they didn't just erase me. They erased you, and I couldn't let them win." Miriam felt something inside her shift, like a locked door had finally clicked open. The man who took her hadn't kidnapped her. He'd come to return something stolen, her past. The morning after their conversation, Liam handed her the final letter. This one was heavier, both in the number of pages and in what it carried. It was a confession, not from him, from her mother. Liam had found it years ago, buried in the ashes of the old house, sealed in a rusted tin box. He'd held onto it, unsure whether to believe it, unsure whether to share it. But now, with Miriam sitting in front of him, remembering who she was, there was no more waiting. She opened it with trembling fingers. The letter detailed a truth her mother had locked away with fire and silence. The boy in the treehouse wasn't just her friend. He was her half-brother. Her father had cheated, twice. Liam's mother had been the housekeeper. Quiet, kind, not from town. When she died in a car crash, there were whispers. But Miriam's mother didn't whisper. She raged. The fire wasn't an accident. It was meant to erase the mistake. Liam. Only it didn't work. He survived. He saved Miriam, and that made her mother furious. So they moved, changed names, invented a past that excluded him, gaslit Miriam into forgetting the boy who'd once sworn to protect her. Until now. Miriam's knees buckled as she finished the last page. Liam caught her before she hit the floor. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. They both knew what had been stolen. Not just a childhood, but a family, a truth, a sense of belonging. Back in town, no one noticed she'd been gone. No police reports, no searches. Her mother never mentioned it. Just told the neighbors Miriam had gone to stay with an aunt for a while. But Miriam didn't go back. She left Maple Hollow with Liam. Not to hide, but to begin again. This time, with the whole truth in her pocket and no more silence in her mouth. She still didn't know where the road would lead, but for the first time she knew who she was. And that was enough.
If you've made it this far, it means this story touched you in some way. So don't leave without subscribing. It really helps the channel and keeps me motivated to share more stories like this. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? And which part of this story moved you the most?